All right, so get ready, because today we are going deep into feminist perspectives on the family.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah, really fascinating stuff, and we're going to be drawing on a really in-depth entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Okay.
It's called, get this, Feminist Perspectives on Reproduction and the Family.
Catchy, I like it.
Yeah, rolls right off the tongue, right? And we're going to kind of explore this idea that the family, which we often think of as this really personal, private sphere,
Yeah.
is actually super intertwined with all these political and social structures.
It's like those, those Russian nesting dolls. You open one and there's another one inside and another and another.
I love that.
The family, often seen as this like private, intimate space, is actually like embedded within these larger systems of power, these norms, these expectations, all this stuff.
Yeah, it's not just about, like, who does the dishes,
Right.
right? It's about how even those very, like, seemingly mundane tasks connect to these much bigger questions of, like, equality and justice and how we actually
Yeah.
structure society.
Exactly. And I think the core ideas we'll be talking about today is this phrase, the personal is political.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that phrase thrown around a lot.
Right.
But I gotta say, it's always felt a little bit abstract to me.
Sure.
Can we maybe unpack that a little bit? Like, what does that actually mean?
Absolutely. Think about it this way. Imagine you're a woman and you really want to pursue like a very demanding career.
Yeah,
Okay, sounds like a personal choice, right?
right,
But what if affordable childcare is just like not a thing?
right.
And there are still all these societal expectations for women to be the primary caregivers.
Yeah.
So suddenly that personal choice is like all tangled up in this web of political and economic stuff, right?
Right. It's almost like those invisible strings that we talked about earlier, right?
Mhm.
Connecting all those nesting dolls together.
Totally.
Yeah.
It seems like it's a personal decision, but actually it's being influenced by this whole system of power dynamics and social norms and all that.
And this connection between the personal and the political, this isn't just some like newfangled idea, right? This has been around for a while.
No, not at all. Even John Stuart Mill, back in the 19th century,
Wow.
he was already writing about gender inequality in the family in his book, The Subjection of Women.
Oh, okay.
And he argued that when you have these power imbalances at home, it can actually prevent progress in society as a whole.
So even way back then, folks were recognizing that, like, what happens in the family doesn't stay in the family.
Precisely.
It actually has these ripple effects throughout the whole of society.
Exactly.
Huh. That's really interesting.
Yeah, Mill had this one example about boys who were raised in very male-dominated households.
Okay.
And he suggested that, those boys, they might grow up and they might really struggle to see women as their equals
Oh, interesting.
because their early experiences in the family have just totally shaped their understanding of gender and power
Yeah.
in a way that has these really long-lasting effects.
It's almost like that saying, you can't draw straight lines in a crooked world, right?
Yeah.
If the foundation of the family is built on this inequality, then how can we possibly create a society that's truly, you know,
It's such a good question. And it leads us to this other really important point that feminist philosophers talk about. Why is the family inherently a subject for justice?
okay, now I'm already hearing the pushback, right?
Yeah.
Hold on.
Mm-hmm.
The family's supposed to be this haven of love and privacy, right? It's separate from the messy world of politics.
Right.
That's what people say, right?
It's the image a lot of people have.
Yeah.
But feminist philosophers are saying, no, that's way too romantic. Like,
Right.
that ignores reality. First of all, not all families are actually havens of love.
Right.
Many families are actually places where there's conflict, there's power struggles, sometimes even violence.
And let's not forget, the state is deeply involved in regulating families.
Yeah.
Right? Like, think about marriage laws and divorce and custody battles and inheritance. All of these have a huge impact on women's lives
Absolutely.
and their equality.
So, yeah, the idea that families are somehow outside of the law, outside of the realm of justice, it doesn't hold up.
Right. They're not these, like, self-contained units, right?
Yeah.
They exist within this larger structure.
They're embedded in these structures.
Yeah.
Legal structures, social structures, totally.
Okay, so we've sort of established, I think, that the family is a subject for justice.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing it gets even more complicated when we start talking about, like, specific family structures.
Of course.
Right.
Yeah.
And, like, how do we even evaluate those through a feminist lens?
So one of the key things we have to do is move beyond these traditional assumptions about what a family should look like.
Okay.
This idea that families are their structures determined by biology or like, some natural order,
Yeah.
that's something that feminists really push back against.
So, like, you're saying we can't just say, oh, it's natural for women to be the primary caregivers
Exactly.
and just, like, leave it at that.
Nope. Feminists have some very compelling answers to that, and they all offer a different perspective on how we think about gender roles and family.
Okay. So let's dive into those perspectives because I have a feeling that's where things get really interesting.
Let's do it. So we're talking about these feminist responses, right, to that idea that family structures are just natural and we can't question them.
Yeah, it's just the way it is.
Exactly. So the first response, it's called social constructivism.
Okay, I've heard that term, but refresh my memory. Like, what's the basic idea?
Sure. Social constructivists argue that how we think about gender roles, it's not determined by biology.
Okay.
It's actually shaped by social norms and, messages we get from our culture, the way we were raised. It's all that stuff. Think about it this way. You know how, like, certain toys are marketed as, like, for boys or for girls?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like, it's like a girl couldn't possibly enjoy playing with, like, a robot, or a boy wouldn't want to have, like, a play kitchen or something.
Exactly. That's
Yeah.
social construction at work. We're
Yeah.
taught from when we're, like, little kids
Okay.
what's considered appropriate behavior for each gender.
Right.
And those expectations extend to how we think about family, too.
So if we're, like, conditioned to believe that women are naturally more nurturing, and therefore they should be the primary caregivers,
Right.
social constructivists would be like, hold on, that's not biology, that's society.
Exactly. It's not saying that there are no biological differences, but it's
Right.
recognizing that culture plays a huge role
Huge role.
in how we understand those differences and the roles we expect people to play in families.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so what's the next response?
So this one is called difference feminism.
Okay.
And it's a little different.
Right.
Instead of trying to erase or downplay gender differences, it tries to actually revalue the traits that we traditionally associate with women, like caregiving or emotional intelligence.
So instead of saying women need to be more like men, they're saying, hey, those qualities that are often seen as feminine, those are actually really important, and we could value those.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that those things, they're not weaknesses.
Right.
Their strengths, and maybe, just maybe, a society that actually values those traits would be a more compassionate and just society overall.
That's really interesting. I like that. Okay, so we got social constructivism, which challenges these assumptions about gender roles, and we've got difference feminism, which is all about valuing these traits that are traditionally associated with women. What's the third one? What's the third approach?
All right. So the third one is called anti-subordination feminism, and it kind of shifts the focus away from these debates about biological differences or even the value of certain traits.
Okay.
It's really concerned with addressing the negative consequences of gender inequality, no matter where it comes from.
So it's like, look, let's just fix the problems that women are facing.
Exactly.
And maybe we can debate the origins of all that later.
Exactly. Anti-subordination feminists, they're basically saying, look, even if there are biological differences between men and women, those differences shouldn't create a hierarchy where one group is always at a disadvantage.
Right. It's about leveling the playing field.
Exactly.
Regardless of gender.
Exactly. And that leads us to the second part of why families are a subject for justice. It's not just about those, essentialist views of gender roles.
Yeah.
It's also about understanding that families, they're not like non-political.
Right.
They're not operating outside of justice.
I think that's where a lot of people get tripped up.
Totally.
Right. We often have this very, like, idealized view of the family. With, like, this private sphere, governed by love and personal choices.
Yeah, it's separate from everything else, like all the bad stuff.
Right. And feminist philosophers are like, no, that's not really how it works.
That's not reality.
Yeah.
For one thing, lots of families aren't peaceful and harmonious.
Right.
There's power imbalances and conflict and even violence.
And like we said before, the state is super involved in regulating families.
Right. Think about marriage.
Yeah, marriage laws, divorce, child custody.
Inheritance, all of it.
All of that stuff. Those legal structures, they have a big impact on how families actually function
They do.
and whether they, reinforce or challenge gender inequality.
Exactly. It's not a question of whether the state should be involved.
Right, because they already are.
It already is.
Yeah.
It's about how we can ensure that those laws and policies are actually promoting justice.
Right, and equality for for everyone in the family.
For everyone.
Exactly. So we got to look at those existing structures with a critical eye and say, are these laws supporting equality?
Right.
Or are they, biased towards one gender over the other?
Exactly. And this leads us to another really important piece of this puzzle, how families impact individuals and society as a whole.
Okay, let's get into that. So how do families shape us? How do those individual experiences then, affect the wider society?
Well, families are often our very first social unit.
Right.
It's where we first learn about relationships and how to deal with conflict, what's right and wrong, all that stuff. Families are almost like little mini societies.
Mini societies.
Yeah, they shape our values.
Yeah.
How we see the world.
It's like that saying, give me a child until he is 7 and I will show you the man.
Yes, exactly.
Those early experiences are so formative.
Totally. And feminist scholars are saying, well, if kids grow up in families where there's a lot of gender inequality, they're going to learn those patterns.
Yeah.
And they might repeat them later in life.
Right. So if a boy sees his dad, constantly making all the decisions,
Right.
and his mom is always the one doing, all the housework, he might just think, oh, well, that's how it is.
That's the natural order of things.
Yeah,
exactly. And then, those beliefs, they can affect how he interacts with women at work,
right.
in his relationships, everywhere.
Yeah.
It's a perfect example of how something that seems really private, like what's happening inside a family,
Right.
can have these huge consequences.
It's those nesting dolls again.
Yes.
Right. The family's nested within these larger systems and they're constantly affecting each other.
It's all connected. And speaking of systems, this brings us to the state's interest in families.
Oh, okay. So now some people might be thinking, wait, shouldn't the state just stay out of family matters? Isn't that a violation of privacy?
Right. And it's a really complicated issue.
Yeah.
And feminist philosophers, they have some really interesting things to say about it.
Okay.
So first of all, like we've been talking about, the state's already really involved in families through laws and policies.
So it's not a question of if, but how they should be involved?
Exactly. And second, they often point out that the state has this vested interest in making sure its future citizens are doing okay.
Yeah.
And who are those future citizens?
Yeah.
Children.
Right, the children being raised in those families.
Exactly. So if the state wants to have a society that's just and successful,
Yeah.
it needs to make sure that kids are growing up in healthy environments.
Right, environments that are teaching them good values, teaching them about equality, fairness.
And that's where the state's interest in families comes in.
Okay.
It's not about, dictating every single thing. It's about creating conditions where all kids, boys and girls, have a chance to thrive.
It's like investing in the future.
Totally.
Right.
It's like by supporting families, the state is actually investing in its own long-term success.
I like that, yeah.
And, this idea of the family being like a training ground for citizens, that's not new.
Oh, really?
Even Plato, back in the day, he was talking about that in his book, The Republic.
Didn't he want to abolish the family altogether?
He did.
Yeah.
He thought that family ties could lead to favoritism and corruption, and they could actually get in the way of creating a truly just society.
Yeah, I could see how abolishing the family might be a little bit extreme.
Yeah, most feminist philosophers don't go that far.
Right.
But his point is still interesting.
Yeah.
It highlights how important family structures are
Yeah.
in shaping who we are and the kind of society we build.
Right. So if we want a just society, we got to think really carefully about how families can help us get there.
Absolutely. We need to create families that are more than just units of reproduction
Right.
or economic survival.
Right.
We need to see them as places where we learn about equality
Yeah.
and justice and how to live together.
Yeah, live well together.
Exactly. But while families can definitely be those things, places of growth and learning,
Uh-huh.
we also have to admit that the way families have traditionally been structured, it often limits not just kids' opportunities, but women's opportunities and freedoms, too.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about that.
Okay.
Because we've talked about, how these structures impact children.
Uh-huh.
But how do they specifically affect women?
So one of the biggest issues is the unequal division of labor inside families.
Right.
Even though more women are working now than ever before,
Yeah.
they still do way more of the housework and the childcare.
It's that classic image of the woman comes home from a long day at work.
Yeah.
And then she immediately starts her second job
Exactly.
of, cooking and cleaning and taking care of the kids.
And the partner is like chilling on the couch.
Exactly.
Oh, no.
And that has real consequences,
It does.
right? For women.
Yeah, it can limit their career choices.
No.
It affects how much money they can make.
Right.
And it even impacts, like, their health and well-being.
I remember, I think I was reading a study that found that women are much more likely to experience poverty after a divorce.
Yes.
And a lot of that is tied to this unequal division of labor
Absolutely.
that you're talking about.
Those economic consequences are really, really serious.
Yeah.
If a woman has been focusing on childcare for years,
Right.
it can be so hard to get back into the workforce on an equal footing.
And even if she can work, it's exhausting
Oh my gosh, yeah.
to have to juggle that second shift at home.
Absolutely.
Right. It leaves you with very little time or energy to, focus on your career.
Right, to try to get ahead.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, and it creates this vicious cycle that feminist economists have been talking about forever.
Right.
It contributes to the gender pay gap.
Right.
It reinforces the idea that women are financially dependent on men.
Yeah.
And it can even make it harder for women to leave relationships that are bad for them.
That's a really good point.
It's not just about who's doing the chores.
Right.
It's about what those choices represent. It's about power. It is about power.
Yeah.
And how that plays out in all these different parts of our lives.
So this leads to a big question.
Yeah.
How should we evaluate family structures? Like, how do we move beyond those traditional models that we've been talking about?
That often lead to these inequalities.
Yeah.
So feminist philosophers, they have some interesting answers to that question.
Okay.
They're looking at families through the lens of, things like choice and equality.
Okay.
And we'll explore those ideas next.
Right. This is where things get really juicy.
I know, right.
Okay, so we've seen how traditional family structures can really lead to some big inequalities.
Yeah, for sure.
But, where do we go from here? How do we start to, imagine and evaluate, different family structures through this feminist lens?
That's the question, right? And feminist philosophers, they offer a few different perspectives.
Okay.
But one place to start is with the idea of choice-based evaluations.
Choice-based, okay.
This is all about individual autonomy and freedom of contract when it comes to family.
So, basically letting people decide what kind of family structure works best for them.
Exactly. This perspective challenges that old idea that there's only one right way to do family.
Yeah, like a cookie-cutter approach.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that there are tons of different kinds of relationships out there.
Right.
And people should be free to choose what aligns with their own values and desires.
Right, and we are seeing that more and more, right, with single-parent families, blended families, LGBTQ plus families, polyamorous relationships, all these different kinds of families.
Exactly. We're moving beyond that narrow definition of the nuclear family.
Right. It's not just, mom, dad, 2.5 kids, and a white picket fence anymore.
Not anymore.
And this idea of choice, it also connects to those debates about things like commercial surrogacy, right?
Absolutely. People who support commercial surrogacy, they often argue that it gives women more reproductive choices.
Right.
And it gives people who might not be able to have kids on their own a chance to become parents.
So, a same-sex couple who wants to have a biological child.
Right.
They could use a surrogate.
Cool.
Or someone who can't carry a pregnancy for medical reasons.
Exactly.
That makes sense. So, from this choice-based view, it sounds pretty empowering, right? It gives women more control over their bodies and their choices.
For sure. But of course, there are ethical concerns here, too.
Right, because, choices aren't made in a vacuum, right?
Exactly.
It's not like we all have the same opportunities.
No, not
Our choices are shaped by so many things, like social norms, economic pressures.
Totally. Yeah, so critics of this choice-based view, and this includes some feminists, they worry that focusing only on individual choice can actually mask some deeper problems.
Okay, what kind of problems?
Well, they point out that it can turn women's bodies into commodities,
Oh, almost like they're being bought and sold.
Yeah, and they also worry about exploitation, especially of women who are struggling financially.
So, if a woman is desperate for money,
right,
she might feel like she has to become a surrogate.
Exactly.
Even if it's not something she really wants.
Exactly. And that's where the choice-based framework kind of breaks down.
Yeah. It's not so simple.
No. It doesn't take into account the bigger picture.
Right. All those social and economic factors.
Exactly. And this brings us to another important perspective.
Right.
Equality-based evaluations of families.
Okay. So how does this one differ from the choice-based approach?
So equality-based feminism, it's all about creating a world where people's choices about family
Yeah.
are actually free,
Yeah.
and where those choices don't just reinforce those old gender inequalities.
So it's not just about letting people choose whatever they want. It's about making sure those choices are made within a system that's fair to everyone.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that choice can be an illusion
Right.
if the system is rigged against you.
Yeah, like if women are still the ones who are primarily responsible for childcare,
Right.
then their careers are going to suffer,
Exactly.
no matter how much choice they theoretically have.
Exactly. So egalitarian feminists, they argue that we need to fix those underlying structural inequalities.
Right.
Things like the gender pay gap,
The gender pay gap. Yeah.
lack of affordable childcare, societal expectations about caregiving.
Right. So it's not just about changing families, it's about changing the whole system.
Yeah, it's about making sure that choices within families are actually free
Right.
and that they don't just reproduce those old patterns of inequality.
So it's creating a world where women don't have to choose between having a family and having a career.
Yes,
They can have both.
they can have both, and that benefits everyone, not just women.
Right. Everybody wins.
Exactly. Now, we've been talking a lot about adults and their choices,
Yeah.
but there's another really important group we need to consider: the kids.
Right. The little ones.
Yeah, how do feminist perspectives address their needs?
Yeah. Because kids don't always have a voice in these decisions.
Right, exactly. So feminist philosophers, they say any discussion of families has to put the needs of children first.
Okay.
They say kids have a right to be raised in environments that are good for them,
Makes sense.
where they can develop and be safe and healthy.
So it's not enough to just focus on what the adults want. We also have to ask how this is going to affect the kids.
Exactly. And this raises some really tricky questions about when the state should step in.
Right, because we want to respect parents' rights to raise their kids how they see fit.
Right. But what happens when those ideas clash with what's best for the child?
That's a tough one. So where do we draw the line?
Well, feminist philosophers, they often talk about a basic interest standard.
Basic interest, yeah.
This means the state has a duty to make sure kids' basic needs are met and that they're protected from harm, even if it means limiting parents' choices a little bit.
It's about finding that balance, right?
Right.
Between protecting kids and respecting family privacy.
Exactly. And all of this gets even more complicated when we think about all the new reproductive technologies that are out there.
Oh, right, like IVF, surrogacy, genetic testing, all that stuff.
Yeah, all of that is really pushing the boundaries of what we even consider a family to be.
Yeah, like it's making us rethink what it even means to be a parent.
Totally. Like if a child is conceived using a donor egg or sperm, who are the real parents?
Right.
What are their rights and responsibilities?
And with surrogacy, the woman who gives birth might not be the one raising the child.
Right.
It's all very new territory.
It is. It's like we're in uncharted waters.
Yeah, we need a new map.
Yeah. And that's why these feminist perspectives are so important.
Yeah.
They give us a way to think about all of this in a
Yeah.
way that puts justice and equality first.
Absolutely. Well, this has been an incredible deep dive.
It has.
We've covered so much ground, how the personal is political, the problems with traditional family structures, all those ethical questions about new technology.
There's so much to think about.
I feel like feminist thought has so much to offer as we navigate this new world.
I completely agree. And as these technologies keep changing, we need to keep asking those tough questions
Yeah,
about how to create families that are truly just and fair
for everyone.
for everyone.
That's a challenge and an opportunity that I think we all need to be a part of.
Totally.
So thanks for joining us for this deep dive into feminist perspectives on the family. We hope you've learned something new and that you'll keep thinking about these issues and what it means to create a world where families are really living up to our highest ideals.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening.